You have the John Ryland papyri, a small portion found in a cave in Egypt that was preserved over all the years, about 125 AD, within 80 years. Then you have the papyri Bodmer. Now, why is it called papyrus? It's written on papyrus. The papyri Bodmer II, right around 155 AD. And then you have the Codex Sinaiticus, the Codex Vaticanus, Codex Alexandrinus. So they sound like diseases. Well, these are titles given to some complete copies of the New Testament. Just time-wise, there is more evidence in the manuscripts, time-wise, for the New Testament than any 10 pieces of classical literature combined. And then, with the second question, the first is the timeline. The second question is very critical, and that's this one. How many manuscripts do you have? Say, what do you mean? Well, the greater numbers, say this is the original and here's the copies. The greater number of the copies that you have, the easier it is to reconstruct the original, the autographa, and check out any errors or discrepancies. Now, in comparing with secular literature, for example, Caesar and the Gallic Wars, 10 manuscripts. But nobody in university questions that Caesar fought the Gallic Wars, and for a long time he was the only one that ever survived that wrote about it. 1,000 years, the closest manuscript after he died, and there's only 10 manuscripts. Of Plato, 7 manuscripts. Of Tacitus, the Roman historian. Right now there's less than 20 manuscripts that have ever survived. And then Thucydides, many people consider Thucydides one of the most accurate historians of antiquity. And yet there's only 7 manuscripts. And those are 1,300 years after Thucydides died. Herodotus is 8 manuscripts in about 1,400 years. With Pliny the Younger, there's about 7 manuscripts. With Sophocles, 193, which is one of the most. Euripides, 9. The men and women, Aristotle, there were 13. Now it's up to 49 they've discovered. Well, with the New Testament, just the New Testament, in the new evidence that demands a verdict, I have now been able to document 24,633 manuscripts of just the New Testament. I never even knew they existed until I set out to make a joke of it. And later, I found out the joke was on me. I had not done my homework.
Nine, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4.
What is necessary for the very existence of science is just the ability to experiment, the honesty in reporting results. The results must be reported without somebody saying what they'd like the results to have had been. And finally, an important thing is the intelligence to interpret the results, but important point about this intelligence is that it should not be sure ahead of time about what must be. Now, it can be prejudiced and say that's very unlikely. I don't like that. Prejudice is different than absolute certainty. I don't mean absolute prejudice, just bias. But not strict bias, see, not complete prejudice. As long as you're biased, it doesn't make any difference, because if the fact is true, there will be a perpetual accumulation of experiments that perpetually annoy you until they cannot be disregarded any longer. Only can be disregarded if you're absolutely sure ahead of time of some precondition that science has to have. In fact, it is necessary for the very existence of science that minds exist which do not allow that nature must satisfy some preconceived conditions like those of our philosophy.
The connection between philosophy and the mathematical sciences has always been very close. Plato had written over the door of his academy the words, "Let no one enter here who is ignorant of geometry." It was Aristotle who codified the basic sciences into the categories and gave them the names that we use to this day. Some of the greatest philosophers have been themselves great mathematicians who invented new branches of mathematics. Descartes is an obvious example, and so is Leibniz and Pascal. In fact, most of the great philosophers, not all, but most, came to philosophy from mathematics or the sciences, and this tendency has continued into our present century. Bertrand Russell was trained first as a mathematician. Wittgenstein was trained first as an engineer. The reason for this persisting connection is, I think, obvious, and that is that the basic urge which has driven most of the greatest philosophers has been the urge to deepen our understanding of the world and of its structure, and this is also what creative scientists are doing.
That's a very interesting question, that people who are both scientists, they look at the same evidence, and I feel it points towards a creator and other people feel it points away. How does that possibly happen? Well, I think the answer to that might be quite subtle and sophisticated, because the relationship between a person's worldview and science is not often very clear. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is it the atheistic worldview that comes first, and so that colours to a certain extent the way we see the evidence in science? Or is it vice versa, and similarly for the theistic worldview? And usually with most people it's a mixture, actually. For example, in my case, I was a Christian believing in God long before I ever understood anything about the higher reaches of science, so that one might argue that science has confirmed my faith. Well, yes, that's absolutely true. I try as hard as I possibly can to look at it through the eyes of an atheist. Now, some atheists are quite explicit that their atheism comes first. One of the most famous is Richard Lewontin, the professor of genetics, who said that it wasn't his science that compelled him to accept a materialistic explanation of the universe. It was an a priori materialism. You start with materialism. And he said that materialism is absolute. And I'm quoting now, "We cannot allow a divine foot in the door." Now, he is breathtakingly honest. He starts with his atheism, and he uses that as a lens through which he looks at his science. So, in one sense, I can't answer the question because I can't speak for other people. The evidence is out there, and all I feel I can do is say, well, to my mind, that points towards God, and here are the reasons. And it's up to someone listening to me to determine, well, is that a priori theism, or does it really constitute evidence? I think it does. I've tried to take very seriously the atheistic case. What disturbs me about the new atheists is they do not appear to take very seriously the Christian case, so there's a bit of an imbalance there.